At my family's New Year's gala, my father raised a glass and erased me. In front of senators, judges, and silver cutlery, he declared I was no longer part of the Warner legacy. No trust, no name, nothing. What they didn't know, what no one at that table could see, was that I had already built something bigger. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about planting power in silence and watching it grow roots no one can pull out. The moment I stepped into that dining room, I knew I'd made a mistake. Not because I wasn't dressed right, though I knew the faded cotton dress and worn boots weren't what they expected. Not because I didn't belong, though the heavy chandelier light felt like it was inspecting me for cracks, but because I had come with the smallest, most dangerous hope that maybe just this once they would see me. Really see me. Mara Ellison, 36, former Yale law student, current founder of a sustainable agriculture tech startup that had just weathered its first profitable year. I hadn't been back in 5 years. Not for holidays, not for weddings, not for the new baby my cousin had posted about with hashtags and heirloom christening gowns. But the invitation came, handwritten in my mother's looping cursive, "We hope you'll join us to reconnect." And part of me, the foolish, still fractured part, wanted to believe it was real. The Ellison family was a legal dynasty in Charleston. My father, Judge Thomas Ellison, known for his scathing opinions and sharper suits. My mother, Dr. Lenore Ellison, lectured constitutional law like scripture. My brother Chase was on the fast track to federal prosecutor, and my sister Alina was being floated as a future partner in one of D.C.'s most prestigious firms. Their world was carved from polished wood and procedural language. And then there was me, the one who walked away. I had barely stepped into the dining room when Alina looked up from her champagne flute, eyes glinting. "Oh good, the runaway gardener made it," she said, her voice loud enough for every polished head at the table to turn. "Did you bring compost for dessert?" The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in volume, it was cruel in precision. The kind of laughter that comes from people who know exactly where to stick the knife and how to make you bleed without raising their voices. I didn't laugh. I just moved to my seat at the far end of the table. The one they'd saved for me. The one closest to the sideboard where the staff would refill water glasses and pretend not to notice the frost in the air. Uncle Paul leaned in toward my father, not bothering to whisper. "She's still playing with plants. What a waste of a Yale degree." My father didn't blink. He adjusted his cufflinks as if that small metal click could flatten my existence. "Let her play," he said. "Every family needs a cautionary tale." They clinked glasses to that. No one asked about my company. No one mentioned the drought resilience program we'd piloted in 7 rural counties. No one even said my name. I was a ghost at the table I once dreamed of owning a seat at. And as I sat there staring into a glass of wine I hadn't touched, wondering whether I had made a catastrophic mistake by coming, my phone buzzed softly against my thigh. I almost didn't look, but I did. "Tasha, assistant to Mins ago. Delilah Forbes just called. You're officially CEO of the year. The piece is live. You're on the cover." I didn't say a word. I just placed my linen napkin gently on the plate, looked up at my father, who was quoting some recent ruling, at my mother, who was praising Alina's engagement to a senator, at Chase, who was giving a speech about honor and discipline, and I realized something piercing and freeing all at once. They hadn't forgotten who I was. They'd never cared to know. And suddenly I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt unburdened. Because sometimes it isn't revenge that tastes sweet. It's the silence that comes after you've outgrown every version of yourself they tried to shrink. I was no longer trying to be seen. I had built something that didn't need their spotlight to grow. And somewhere under that chandelier, amid the silver forks and family performance, a seed of something stronger took root. Before I was the founder of True Root, I was just another overachiever on the marble pathways of Yale Law. I had the credentials lined up like dominoes, top of my class summer associate at a D.C. firm fast-tracked for the federal clerkship pipeline. My professors smiled with approval. My father, Judge Ellison, told everyone I'd be the one to restore moral clarity to appellate law. I was 24, already framed in their minds as a legacy, sealed and guaranteed. And then I went to Georgia. It was supposed to be a harmless externship, a legal research project in a flood-prone agricultural county. I was tasked with analyzing outdated land use codes and drafting policy recommendations. I brought color-coded folders and every intent to stay detached. But detachment became impossible the day I met Roy. He was a third-generation farmer, kind eyes, sunburned skin, and a voice like gravel soaked in honey. He walked me through his ruined acreage mud tugging at our boots. Corn stalks lay collapsed like drowned soldiers. His barn had taken in 5 feet of water. The smell of mildew clung to everything, even his clothes. He kept apologizing. "It's never this bad," he said over and over, like the water owed him an explanation. 2 days after I left, I got a call from the county clerk. Roy had taken his own life. That night I sat on the cold tile floor of my dorm, surrounded by law journals and half-filled coffee mugs. But I couldn't read, I couldn't think about torts or zoning laws. I could only think about Roy's hands, rough, gentle shaking, as he showed me where the crops had died. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and started sketching. Not legal arguments, sensors, probes, soil monitors that could detect early signs of flooding or drought. Maybe if he'd known earlier. Maybe if someone had given him more than condolences. Maybe. By sunrise, I had pages of messy diagrams and not a single doubt. 3 weeks later, I withdrew from Yale. My father didn't yell. He folded the morning paper slowly, the way someone closes a door on purpose. "If you want to live like a farmer," he said, "go dig your own field." My mother didn't argue either. She cried not privately, but dramatically in front of dinner guests and our church pastor. "She's been radicalized," she whispered, like I joined a cult instead of followed a calling. Chase posted a status on Facebook that read, "Guess we lost Mara to the kale cult. Buckle up, y'all." Alina didn't say anything. She just sent back my last text with a thumbs-up emoji. Within a week, I was removed from the Ellison Trust documentation. My name was quietly omitted from the program at the annual Ellison Gala. The family newsletter. Yes, there was a newsletter. Simply said Mara has decided to take time off to explore other interests. They didn't disown me loudly, they just made sure I was invisible. So I left Charleston. I found a half-collapsed shipping container on the edge of a fallow soybean field in Nebraska, paid 3 months in cash. It had no plumbing, barely had power, and smelled faintly of rust and mouse droppings. I hauled in a thrift store mattress, a camp stove, and my half-broken laptop. That was where True Root began. Though back then it wasn't a company. It wasn't even a prototype. It was just me, a blinking cursor, and the wind howling through the holes in the metal walls like a ghost that hadn't been fed. I coded until my hands cramped. I scribbled on walls when I ran out of paper. I read agricultural reports by flashlight. The first soil sensor I built short-circuited so badly it smoked. The second shattered in the cold. The third sort of worked for 6 hours. I lived on gas station coffee and ramen noodles. I stole Wi-Fi from a diner down the road and spent entire nights just refreshing data tables, watching moisture levels fluctuate like heartbeats. And still no one believed in it. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't a farmer. I was just a dropout in a shipping container trying to prove to ghosts that I could build something that mattered. But the silence in Nebraska was different than the silence in Charleston. It didn't judge. It didn't echo with disapproval. It held space. And in that space, a seed began to grow. Some nights in the container, the wind screamed so loudly it felt like the sky was grieving. I slept with one hand on my laptop and the other wrapped in a blanket that smelled like gasoline. Mice gnawed the plywood floors beneath me. My heater sputtered like it had second thoughts about existing. Every morning, I'd wake up with dust in my throat and start again. The first version of the sensor barely lasted 3 days. The wiring corroded, the readings glitched, the casing cracked in the frost. I cried once quietly when I realized the third prototype had been sending fake moisture alerts for weeks. I'd staked everything on something I didn't fully know how to build. The world outside moved on. People were being promoted, getting married, adding titles to their names. I was in a rusted box with broken tech and a hope that refused to die. And then one afternoon, a letter arrived. A real letter. Stamped. Postmarked. The envelope was soft cream, and the handwriting was careful, slightly slanted, like someone used to precision, but now reaching for meaning. Inside one line, I used to calibrate flight systems for NASA, but lately I've been dreaming about earthbound miracles. Do you need someone just crazy enough to believe in this with you? It was signed Naomi Tran. 2 weeks later, she drove up in a rust-colored Prius with a cracked bumper and a duffel bag full of wires. She didn't knock. She just opened the container door and said I brought soldering irons and jasmine rice. Which do we need? First, Naomi was brilliant in that quiet, gravitational way, the kind of woman who could fix a circuit board and boil tea in the same breath. She didn't ask for backstory. She didn't flinch at the rodents. She just got to work. We rebuilt everything from scratch. By day, we tested soil samples and rewired sensor nodes. By night, we wrote code and mapped out data dashboards on the backs of pizza boxes. The heater broke. We wore 2 coats. The lights flickered. We built around it. Naomi said, "Innovation is mostly adaptation." I said, "So is survival." Our fingers went numb in the cold. We bled from stripped wires. Once we duct-taped a busted sensor to a tractor axle just to see if it could survive vibration. It couldn't. But we learned. The real breakthrough came after a storm. A farmer outside of Kearney let us trial the latest version of the sensor. He didn't believe in tech. "Soil talks to you if you listen," he'd said. But he let us bury the nodes by his irrigation lines anyway. 3 months later, the drought hit. Every field around him wilted into cracked earth and dust. But his crop, 30% yield increase. The data glowed. Our dashboards danced. His wife hugged me beside the barn, hands still dusted with flour from making cornbread. "My daughter," she whispered, "gets to stay in college because of you." That night, Naomi brought out her rice cooker and cooked us a proper meal for the first time in weeks. I hadn't tasted real food in so long I nearly cried. She handed me a bowl, then looked at the sensor on the table, like it was our child. We called it TrueSense. It wasn't fancy, just a small, rugged node you could push directly into the soil. It measured moisture temperature and nutrient levels in real time, sending data to an app we'd pieced together with borrowed libraries and broken sleep. 17 investors passed. One said, "Cute, but farmers don't use apps." Another smiled through the pitch and ghosted us by morning. A third called us idealistic. But we kept going. Not for them. For Roy. For the farmer's daughter. For the little light we saw in each other's exhausted eyes when something finally worked. We didn't have a plan. Just conviction. And maybe that was enough. Because from rust and roots, True Root was growing not fast, not loud, but real. By the 12th rejection, Naomi stopped bothering to dress up for the pitches. The 13th said our idea was visionary, which in Silicon Valley meant romantic, but unfundable. The 14th told us with a gentle smile that agriculture wasn't sexy enough. One investor suggested we pivot to indoor vertical farming. Another said farmers wouldn't trust girls with gadgets. Some didn't say anything at all. They just let our emails die unopened. 17 in total. 17 polite declines. 17 ways of saying this isn't real enough. What they didn't see were the burn marks on Naomi's hands from soldering iron mishaps. They didn't see the notes scribbled on diner napkins at 2 a.m., or the time I pawned my watch to afford a new circuit board. They didn't see us, and in a way that made it easier to stay invisible. At least we didn't owe them a show. The 18th meeting almost didn't happen. We couldn't afford the gas to drive into Omaha, and the only room available was a rented storage unit that smelled like someone had lived there through winter and lost the fight. We borrowed 2 metal folding chairs from a neighbor, cleaned the floor, dragged in a table, and brought 2 5-gallon buckets of Nebraska soil. That was our pitch deck. Rachel arrived wearing old Converse jeans and a windbreaker that had clearly seen better years. She was in her 50s, maybe older, with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense energy. She didn't ask for our credentials. She didn't shake hands with awkward expectation. She looked at the buckets. Then at the dashboard Naomi had wired into a dusty tablet propped up on a milk crate. "You brought dirt," she said. "We brought proof," I replied. Naomi knelt beside the sensors, flicked one switch, and the dashboard lit up live readouts. Real-time moisture, temperature shifts, mineral levels. We watched the soil speak. Rachel watched too, quietly, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a verdict from the earth itself. "Can it scale?" she asked. "Yes," I said, then hesitated. "If we have time. And trust." "Do you eat lunch?" she asked next. That stopped us. I looked at Naomi. Naomi blinked. "No," I admitted. Rachel laughed. The sound was bright and sharp, like glass catching sun. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a checkbook. She didn't ask for projections, or market share, or founder equity terms. She just scribbled a number, $50,000, and passed it across the dirt-stained table. "Lunch is on me," she said. Naomi looked at me like we'd imagined it. I touched the paper. It felt real. That money didn't change our lives overnight, but it changed our hours. It meant we didn't have to choose between food and firmware. It meant the container had heat again. It meant maybe, just maybe, we could run a pilot outside the shadow of poverty. We picked a small farm on the edge of state lines land that had been struggling for years. The farmer Dean didn't believe in tech either, but his wife did. She saw something in Naomi's calm eyes and my calloused hands. "Fine," he said. "You get one shot." 3 months later, they had their best yield in 5 years. 32% growth, 27% less water used. And more importantly, their son decided not to sell the place after graduation. Naomi cried in the truck on the way home. I didn't. I just looked out at the fields, gold-tipped, waving like quiet applause, and felt the kind of peace I hadn't known since Roy. That was when Rachel called again. "You ready for the next level?" she asked. "What level is that?" I said. "Government." She introduced us to an advisor from the USDA, then someone from Walmart's Sustainable Agriculture Program. At first they nodded through our presentations like everyone else. But this time, we had more than buckets of dirt. We had stories. We had numbers. We had truth wrapped in real stained hands. The pilot they offered us was cautious: a few farms, a 6-month window, limited exposure. But it was enough. Because it came with something we'd never had before. A yes. And in a world built on no a yes, can sound like thunder. The envelope arrived without fanfare. Tucked between utility bills and seed invoices, it looked out of place: cream-colored heavy stock, the kind of paper that makes silence feel expensive. My name was written in looping cursive, every letter deliberate, as if someone had paused between each stroke. Mara Ellison. I hadn't heard my mother say it in 5 years. Inside was the invitation: the Ellison Family New Year's Gala. Formal attire requested, esteemed guests expected. Location unchanged: the ancestral estate in Charleston marble and mahogany tradition dripping from its crown moldings. At the bottom in familiar lavender ink, "We hope you're ready to reconnect." Naomi found me standing by the wood stove, the letter still open in my hands. "You're not seriously going," she said. "I'm not going for them," I said, voice steady. "I'm going so they see, with their own eyes. No headlines, no press releases, just me." Naomi folded her arms. "Then don't go dressed like you owe them anything." I didn't. I wore a cotton dress the color of plowed earth. My boots still carried the dust of our last field visit. No makeup. My old Casio watch, scratched and stubborn, clung to my wrist. I pulled my hair into a low practical bun, the kind I'd worn through blizzards and wiring repairs. The plane ride was short, but the distance between who I'd been and who I'd become felt immeasurable. I rented a pickup. The seat smelled faintly of motor oil and sun-dried vinyl. As I drove past the towering Ellison & Sons law office, I slowed just enough to see the billboard my father, arms crossed, and my brother Jacob beside him, the legacy, the heir. 5 years ago, I'd dreamed of being up there too. Now, I only felt the wind pushing against my window like it wanted me to keep moving. The estate looked exactly as I remembered. Too polished, too perfect, chandeliers glowing like interrogator lights, marble floors that echoed every misstep. When I walked through the double doors, no one reached out. No one said my name. My cousin, whom I hadn't seen since college, raised a manicured brow. She really came. My mother, in lavender silk, glanced down at my dress. "At least she didn't wear overalls," she muttered to a guest. I kept walking. Through the halls of legacy, past oil, portraits of ancestors who'd sat on benches and boards, not tractors, past the ballroom where my sister once had a string quartet for her 16th birthday, past the library where I cried the night I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. The dining room doors opened like a theater's curtain call. Silver gleamed, wine poured, crystal clinked like a warning. My father stood. His presence still filled rooms like verdicts. This year, he said, raising his glass was another triumph for the Ellison legacy. One son defending justice, one daughter stepping into public service, and a new generation rising strong. Polite applause followed. Practiced, hollow. Jacob spoke next, bragging about his latest federal case. My sister Elise announced her engagement to a senator's son with a giggle that landed like a resume line. No one mentioned me, not until an uncle chuckled and said, "Mara's doing dirt farming now." Right. Before I could answer, my mother cut in with her signature smile. "Mara's on a journey of self-discovery in the Midwest. We've always encouraged individuality." The words hit like ice, slipped down my spine. Jacob leaned in during the soup course, the scent of cedar cologne clinging to him like performance. "If you come back," he whispered, "Dad might forget all this ever happened. There's still a seat for you, just not the one at the head." I didn't respond, just smiled the way Naomi taught me, the kind that looks warm but doesn't give anything away. Then came the moment. The main course was served duck à l'orange, perfectly pink, surrounded by microgreens. My father stood again, lifting his glass. This year, he said, also requires clarity. Mara Ellison will no longer be included in any financial, legal, or inheritance structures of the Ellison family. A pause. Heavy. Deliberate. She has, by her own choice, stepped away from our values. We respect her autonomy and accept her absence. No one gasped, no one cried. This was rehearsed. Some even nodded in quiet agreement like it was a boardroom decision, not the severing of bloodlines. I didn't flinch. I cut into my duck slowly, the blade whispering against the porcelain. Inside, though, something bloomed. Not rage, not grief, certainty. They thought they were cutting me off, but I'd already rooted myself somewhere deeper. I no longer needed to be attached. Before I could say a word, Elise chimed in, all teeth and diamonds. "It's really brave of you, pretending kale can change the world." I looked at her, at the senator's ring on her finger, at the manicured hands that had never known the sting of soil, and I nearly laughed. My phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times. That rhythm. Emergency. "Naomi." "Excuse me," I said calmly, placing my napkin on the table. My father smirked. "Startup drama." I stepped onto the veranda. The December air kissed my face like memory. "Naomi." Her voice was breathless. "They signed. Walmart and USDA. It's done. We just jumped to a $185 million valuation. Forbes wants you in D.C. tomorrow." I didn't respond. I looked up at the Charleston stars, the same ones I'd once cried under, certain I'd lost everything. And then I walked back in. I sat down, lifted my glass. "I apologize for taking a call during dinner," I said. "But it seems my little kale hobby just fed a nation." Silence. Not a stunned silence, a revealed one, as if the room had finally seen something they didn't understand and couldn't ignore. My mother's spoon slipped from her hand. My father adjusted his cufflinks, but no words came. I set my glass down untouched. They hadn't just lost control of me. They'd lost their narrative. 3 days after the gala, my face was on the homepage of a national legal blog, and not for Forbes. The headline read, "True Root Under Scrutiny for USDA Deal Ethics or Exploitation." They used a photo from the tech summit, the one where I was holding a clump of soil like it was sacred. Now it looked like evidence. The article was vicious, seeded with anonymous claims that our USDA contract had been fast-tracked due to familial proximity to government insiders. The implication was unmistakable. My father. My brother. My bloodline. I stared at the screen, chest hollowed. Naomi stood behind me, jaw tight. "You know who this is," she said. I didn't need to ask. It was Jacob. The quote came from a federal legal advisor, DE. His initials, his knife. A silent betrayal turned public. Hours later, Mid-Agri filed a lawsuit. They claimed our soil sensor design was a derivative of a prototype they had shelved years ago. They even had dated blueprints. It didn't matter that we'd never seen them. It didn't matter that our tech was built from late-night schematics on diner napkins and half-broken boards. They had lawyers. And now we had a narrative we didn't choose. By nightfall, Forbes pulled our feature. The USDA postponed the contract. Investors started asking for clarity. And somewhere my brother was probably sipping wine watching it all burn down. Naomi sat beside me in the office, 2 mugs of burnt coffee between us. We didn't speak for a long time. Then she whispered, "We fight, not with noise, with truth." That night we didn't call lawyers. We called farmers. We collected every field report, every yield spike, every water reduction stat. We gathered testimonies, not from boardrooms, but from barns. Letters from single mothers who kept their land. Videos of kids talking about how their dads didn't have to sell the farm. We compiled it all. Charts, before and after photos, handwritten thank you notes. We sent it to journalists, to food justice coalitions, to nonprofits. And yes, we sent it to the USDA. Our email subject line was simple: "The soil speaks." 2 days later, my phone rang. A steady voice on the line. "This is Mitchell from USDA. We've reviewed the data. The suspension is lifted. The contract stands." I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I just looked at Naomi and said, "Book every outlet that ghosted us. It's our turn to talk." That week, we turned a grain shed into a press room. No spin, no PR firm, just Naomi, me, and the truth stitched in dirt. At the podium, I held up the same clump of soil. This time it wasn't evidence, it was testimony. We didn't build True Root to win contracts. We built it because people like Roy Caldwell deserve better. Because land isn't a commodity, it's inheritance, history, hope. The cameras flashed, and this time, no one looked away. Because we weren't burning, we were blooming. The courthouse air was thick with recycled air and anticipation. I stood at the defendant's table in a charcoal dress borrowed from Naomi, my palms pressed flat on the smooth oak. Across the aisle, Jacob Ellison, once my hero, now my plaintiff, adjusted his tie and rose to speak. His voice was polished, rehearsed, soaked in legal confidence. "Your Honor, this case is not about sibling rivalry," he began. "It's about ethical boundaries. The defendant exploited familial access to secure a $70 million USDA contract she had no business receiving." He didn't glance my way. Not once. Not even as he questioned my legitimacy, my leadership, my life's work. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Naomi leaned close. "He's overplaying. Keep steady." When it was our turn, I walked to the stand without a script. Only a folder. Only memory. "True Root was born in a metal container with no heat and mice underfoot," I said. "Our first dashboard was coded between shifts at a gas station. Our sensors were assembled by hand with second-hand parts and stubborn faith." I opened the folder. Inside were before and after images of fields saved, pie charts showing drought resilience, a letter from a Kansas farmer. "You helped keep our home." Then Naomi stood. "We'd like to introduce evidence," she said. "A recorded call, legally obtained." The judge nodded. The courtroom speakers crackled. Jacob's voice unmistakable. "She's a liability. Once we discredit her, we can buy the tech for pennies." Gasps, then silence. As if the air had been punched from the room. Naomi didn't flinch. "There's more." She called a surprise witness, Walter Graham, a retired USDA data engineer. Slow-weathered, credible. I worked with Midagri. They pressured me to bury environmental data back in 2016. I refused. But TrueRoot, they never asked me to fudge anything. They asked questions, honest ones. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Thank you, Mr. Graham. Moments later, the gavel fell. This court finds no evidence of ethical or legal wrongdoing by the defendant. Case dismissed, with prejudice. The phrase echoed like a song I never thought I'd hear. Naomi reached for my hand, and I let her. Jacob stood frozen papers in his grip like broken promises. As we stepped into the Charleston sun, the cameras waited. But this time I didn't hide, because this wasn't vindication, it was reclamation. Back in Nebraska, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner. The office lights at TrueRoot were dimmed for the first time in weeks. The team had planned a small celebration. No confetti, no formal speeches, just potluck dishes arranged on folding tables and laughter that floated between engineers and farmers. Naomi handed me a slice of chocolate cake she didn't even pretend to have baked. You okay? She asked quietly. I think so, I said. But I wasn't sure. After the others left, I returned to my desk. That's when I found it tucked between pages of a quarterly report. Cream stationery, faded ink, the Warner family crest embossed in the corner. My heart stilled. It was from my mother. Delilah, it read. I don't know how to apologize for being silent so long. I was afraid you weren't like us, but I was wrong. You are the braver version of everything we hope to be. Love, Mom. I read it 3 times, once with disbelief, once with trembling hands, and once like it was a seed I had to plant in memory. 3 days later, I met her at a riverside cafe in Charleston, a halfway place. She was already seated stirring tea like it might reveal answers if she stared long enough. Her hair was grayer, her eyes softer. We didn't talk about the lawsuit, or Jacob, or the contract. We talked about a sunflower. When you were 8, she said, smiling faintly, you planted one by the mailbox. Jacob ripped it out because it didn't match the landscaping. She shook her head. We didn't know how to love what didn't look like us. I didn't say I forgave her. I didn't know if I did. But I reached across the table, rested my hand on hers. It was enough. For now. Then came the question I didn't expect. Your father, she said, wants to come to Nebraska. He says he'd like to see what you've built. I didn't answer. I just looked out at the river. Its current was slow, steady, and different. Maybe he would come. Maybe he wouldn't. But I had built something that didn't need permission to exist, and now it had deep roots. Even if he never said thank you, I could still show him. I had planted more than seeds. I had planted myself. 1 year later, TrueRoot reached further than I ever dreamed. We were in Kenya now, in Bolivia, in rural California. Not just selling tech, but planting trust-building programs with locals, learning from old soil and new minds. But what made me proudest wasn't on any investor slide. It was a name. The We Plant Without Permission Scholarship Fund. We created it for the girls who'd been told they were too much, too loud, too brown, too poor, too curious, too stubborn, too alive. Each scholarship bore the name of a native crop: cassia, maize, jasmine, bamboo, stubborn, resilient, rooted. At our education summit, I introduced one of the first scholars, a 12-year-old girl named Raina from Mississippi. I want to build a machine that makes rain for my grandma's farm, she said, her voice small but certain. I bent slightly. We'll build it together. That night, long after the crowd left, I walked behind the shed where it all began. The tree I planted my first night in Nebraska now shaded half the field. I knelt beneath it, dug a shallow hole, and placed something inside my first notebook. The one with smeared pencil lines. Words like moisture yield hope. No cameras, no fanfare, just soil and silence. I don't walk away from power. I plant it where they can't see it grow. And now, the wind knows my name.